Hello and welcome to a very special How I Print Things. Now, special because I'm going to do a little bit of painting in this as well to help demonstrate the differences in styles that you might want to use to help mitigate some of the effects of printing with FDM. Now, in my hand here, I've got one resin printed miniature and one that I printed using FDM on my Ender 3. The difference between them up close is pretty visible. The resin fella is much smoother. I've used a gloss varnish on him to bring out some of the armor details, whereas our fella with the FDM, we can see some of the layer lines, especially around his helmet. Now, here's the thing I want to sort of look at talking about, and that is what's called the thumbnail effect. Now, up close, these differences are visible, and you can tell which machine made which miniature. But if we put them down at the table distance, and think of it like you would as if you were looking at a thumbnail for a photograph or anything like that, and suddenly you get the point I'm making. So what we're going to do is a couple of tricks you can use to help paint your miniatures in such a way that we're going to mitigate some of the visible layer lines and make sure that when they're out there on the table, your miniatures are not going to look too bad. And especially if you're doing a whole army of them, you're painting for spectacle rather than display, you'll find that this works really well. Now, why would I print in such bright green? It does make it a little bit difficult to actually demonstrate on camera because this doesn't show up particularly well with any light on it. But that's actually something that I look for when I'm doing the printing because it helps me to spot any imperfections when I can see them very clearly in person. Some people I know, they like to print in grey or black. I'd probably suggest grey is going to be the better choice there because black can obscure some things when you're trying to work on it. Now, the first thing that you want to do, if you've got one of these that's come off the machine, is to actually hit it with a gloss varnish. Now, this can come out of a spray can or out of a pot, but because of the way that gloss varnish works, it's trying to create a single smooth surface for us to paint over. Well, not paint over, to shine instead, let's say. Now, over these layer lines, that's going to help us out a lot because we want to try and get these guys on the table without having to muck around with lots of sanding and filing and so on. So the first thing I did was I actually grabbed some Citadel Art Coat, just brushed it on. I've given that a couple of coats, and here's one we prepared earlier. This is what you're going to get. And that's even harder to see because, my goodness, that is shining. But once you've done this, you'll notice that it feels a little bit smoother to the touch, and we can actually go ahead and prime it like we would any other miniature. So I'm going to hit this with some Chaos Black spray now, and we'll see what we get then. Now that probably looks a lot more sensible, and particularly around the helmet, you might see it's actually a great deal smoother than even I had expected. There is, using this method, a little bit of loss of detail, because, by nature, you're having to fill in some of these gaps. And while some of those are going to be layer lines, others are actually going to be parts of the miniature. So there is that toss-up to make about how much of this you want to put on and how far you want to take it. Personally, I think a little more is better than not enough. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to skip through some of these painting steps a bit quickly because the painting itself is not really the tricky part. I've got some Warplock bronze, and I am just going to jam this on straight out of the pot, and I'm going to go all over the entire miniature with this. This is going to form the basis for most of the miniature because of the fact he's covered in armor. So that's nice and simple. And then once that's dried, we're going to overbrush with a bit of lead belcher. Now you want to try and leave some of the Warplock bronze in the recesses, but don't worry too much if you don't. The idea with this is that you want to sort of fake out some of the edges of the armor so that instead of getting really crisp, clean lines, it looks a little bit more battered. And that sort of helps call attention away from the fact that it is printed. Make sure as well, fill in the gun here. And that's that step finished. Yeah. And then for the last of the metallic colours, I've got here some Balthazar gold. And I'm just going to pick out a few areas that I want to be that cool brassy colour. So obviously these guys being sort of essentially made up, you can paint them however you like. I like to be pretty sparing with this brassy stuff, just enough that we get a little bit to look at on the models. So pick out wherever you fancy that looking now, and then we'll get on to the next step. Now for those sections I want to be red, I'm going to use Mephiston red, I recommend, of course, you can change this out for whatever you might like. I just really like how red looks with this, more plate armor sort of looking stuff. So, green might work here, purple if you fancy. But as you see, there is not much of this on the model. Now, just due to the way that some of the clothing is layered on these guys, I'm going to do any leather areas first, because there's some straps, and boots and things like that, which are easier to reach before we do the trousers and what have you. So I've got here, this is Vallejo Saddle Brown, and I love this colour. Looks pretty bright going on, and you may find in some areas you want a second coat, but this will do perfectly well for all of those leather areas. And then to finish off our base coats, any cloth areas, so trousers and what have you, fill that in now with a bit of Rakarth flesh. So areas like this, any gaps in his armor where you can see sleeves and what have you, take a bit of time and it will brighten up the miniature quite a bit when we come to actually paint him. Well, finish painting him. Now once all of those base coats are applied, no great surprise, we're going straight to Agrax Earthshade. And that's going to do the same thing on these printed miniatures as it would on anything that was ordinary plastic. You want to be a little bit more generous with it than you normally would, but just go around now, make sure you're getting into all the recesses. Now this, of course, is a pretty simple colour scheme. Depending on what you're printing, you may find, of course, that it needs a little bit more time or colour or what have you, but for the purposes of demonstrating these particular techniques, I thought these are pretty cool. They're also really neat miniatures in general. So let's get this Agrax Earthshade on. And then we'll leave him to dry. It'll take about 20-30 minutes. Now, so far, so familiar. That all looks pretty easy, right? That's how we'd normally paint him. But here's where things differ a little bit. If I were to go ahead and, say, dry brush him, or to highlight him in, let's call it the Citadel style, where I paint a single straight edge with a brighter colour, all that's going to do is really highlight the fact, no pun intended, that he's got visible lines on him. What we want to try and do instead is sort of draw our viewer's eye to where we want them to look. So to do that, instead we're going to use quite blocky highlights. Now I've got some iron breaker like I would normally highlight this with, and instead of painting a single straight line across any sort of detailed areas, I'm going to quite liberally bring up the dome part of the helmet, let's say. Just quickly paint around there. In the sallet section. And what I'm going to do is try to just very quickly bap on, real scientific terms here, and just get a little bit of iron breaker highlight to really accentuate where I want the bright part to be and really be cartoony with it. Okay, so back of his wrist here, for example, his back of his hand. The knee pad's another good example. You see, I'm really painting in most of it again and leaving just a very little amount of the shade in the recesses. Now there you can see what a big difference that makes. By leaving just a little bit of the original metal color in the recesses, we get a really high contrast, which is quite comic book, but it works really well for these 3D printed miniatures. We'll do the same thing with the red. I've got here some Evil Sun Scarlet, and we're going to paint over most of this red area and leave quite blocky shading in the recesses there. So let's go around, we'll finish off that. And then we'll use a little Ushabti bone on the clothing to do the same thing again. So leaving a little bit of the darker color towards the edges and be quite generous, quite blocky with your highlighting. So now after that, I'm just going to highlight the leather and any of those brassy bits. And I'm going to use Vallejo's red leather for this. And I am going to highlight this a little bit more traditionally, because these are some areas that I want to look a little bit more, let's say, regimented and straight. So a little bit of that, and then just a couple of dots of Liberator Gold to brighten up some of these brassy bits. With those last couple of highlights applied and his base on as well, that's what we've got. And as you can see, it's not really too bad. What we're trying to take advantage of is a little trick of psychology, which is the fact that human beings, we like to see patterns. So if I were to dry brush this, we'd accentuate all of the all of the layer lines that are there. But instead, because we're painting in such big blocky colours, the eye looks, glances, and it sees what it wants to see. So in that way, we're actually saving ourselves a bit of trouble, and I think it looks pretty cool. Particularly, like I said, we'll go for that thumbnail effect. And there's just 3 of these guys on the table. Now, I've got a few more that need to be done, but maybe that goes some way to helping sort of point out how you can mitigate some of the effects of layer lines visible from your 3D prints. So as always guys, if you've got any questions, feel free to drop them in the old box below. I'm going to try and hit a few more little historical and inspired bits and pieces with this series. Now these models in particular, these come courtesy of the Maker's Cult, and I'm going to link their CG Trader store down there as well. You can purchase these models available as STL files, and if you happen to have a printer, either resin or FDM, you can go ahead and make these at home as well. So, thank you very much for your time guys, and you enjoy the rest of your day.